Anthony Haener wasn't the sort of man you'd notice in a crowd. A slender figure in his mid-30s, he blended into the background like a dull painting on the wall. His face was unremarkable, slightly gaunt, with deep-set eyes and thinning brown hair. He worked a nondescript job as a janitor at a high school in a quiet suburb of a Midwestern city, pushing a mop through silent hallways long after the students had gone home. To his co-workers and the few neighbors who bothered to remember his name, Anthony was forgettable. But Anthony didn't mind being invisible. It allowed him to do his work without suspicion. He wasn't the kind of man who sought fame or notoriety. He wasn't one of those killers who wanted headlines or recognition. Anthony Haener simply had a job to do, and he did it with quiet efficiency. His tool of choice was a small ball peen hammer, about 14 inches in length. He liked the way it fit into his hand, the weight of it, a solid, compact instrument of death. The rounded head could cave in a skull with a single swing, and the peen end, pointed and sharp, could finish the job if necessary. It was the perfect weapon for someone who didn't want to leave a mess. A quick, brutal strike, and the work was done. But Anthony wasn't just some random killer. He didn't murder for the thrill of it. He wasn't driven by some sadistic urge to torture or humiliate his victims. In his mind, he was doing society a favor. Every person he killed was, in his eyes, a blight on the world, a stain that needed to be wiped away. He killed with purpose, methodically choosing his victims based on one simple criterion: they were harmful. Scum, as he liked to think of them, people who used others, who preyed on the weak or helpless. Those were the people Anthony Haener believed the world would be better without. It started with his father, when Anthony was only 16. His father had been a violent man, an alcoholic who beat his mother until she could take no more and left them when Anthony was 13. Anthony's father turned his fists on him after that, lashing out in drunken rages. Anthony was a quiet, thoughtful boy who spent most of his time alone, trying to avoid the wrath that always seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. One evening, after a particularly savage beating, Anthony had enough. His father lay passed out on the living room floor, an empty whiskey bottle clutched in his hand. Anthony walked into the garage, his heart pounding in his chest, and picked up the small hammer that had been his father's, a tool for fixing cars that never worked. He stood over his father for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the slow, shallow breaths of a man who was more monster than father. In Anthony's young mind, it was simple. His father was scum. His father was harmful. His father deserved to die. With a calmness that felt foreign, Anthony raised the hammer and brought it down on his father's head. The sound was soft, almost disappointing, a dull thud as the skull cracked beneath the force of the blow. His father twitched once, then lay still. Anthony stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the body, waiting for some sense of guilt or regret to wash over him. But it never came. Instead, he felt relief. The house was quiet, and for the first time in years, Anthony felt safe. He cleaned up the blood, wrapped his father's body in a tarp, and dragged it to the old well behind their house. It took him most of the night to push the body down into the darkness, but when he was done, Anthony felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He had done what needed to be done. His father was gone, and the world was better for it. The police never suspected a thing. His father had a reputation as a drunk, and when he simply disappeared one day, no one asked too many questions. Most people assumed he had run off or died in some forgotten corner of the city. Anthony played the part of the grieving son well enough to avoid suspicion, and life went on. But something had awakened in Anthony that night. A sense of power, of purpose. He realized that there were others like his father, people who hurt, who used, who preyed on the innocent. And they too deserved to die. The next victim came 5 years later, a man named Richard Avery. Anthony had graduated high school by then and had taken a job as a janitor, content to live a quiet, unremarkable life. But one evening, while cleaning the locker room after a football game, he overheard 2 students talking about a man in town who was known for taking advantage of young girls. They laughed and joked about it, but Anthony's blood ran cold. He knew Richard Avery. He had seen him around town, always leering at the young women who walked by, always with that smug, predatory smile. Anthony couldn't shake the thought of him after that. He followed Avery, watched him for weeks. He saw how Avery would linger outside the local bars, waiting for some drunk girl to stumble out, how he would offer them a ride, how he would disappear with them into the night. Avery was scum. And Anthony knew what he had to do. He waited for the right moment, late one night when Avery was walking home alone after another night of trolling the bars. Anthony approached him from behind, the ball peen hammer tucked inside his jacket. He walked with purpose, his footsteps soft on the empty street. Avery never saw him coming. The hammer came down with a sickening crunch, right at the base of Avery's skull. He crumpled to the ground like a rag doll, and Anthony struck again, just to be sure. There was no struggle, no screams, just the dull thud of metal against bone. Anthony dragged Avery's body into the alley and left it behind a dumpster. The police found him the next morning, and though there were whispers of foul play, no one looked too closely. Avery wasn't exactly a beloved figure in the community, and most people were happy to be rid of him. From that point on, Anthony refined his process. He didn't kill often, once, maybe twice a year, when he found someone who fit his criteria. He stalked his victims carefully, watching them for days, weeks if necessary, to make sure they deserved what was coming to them. He was patient, methodical. He followed the news, kept track of local rumors, listened for whispers of cruelty or abuse. The world was full of scum, people who used their power to hurt others, who preyed on the weak and vulnerable. And Anthony believed it was his duty to rid the world of them. There was the local drug dealer who sold heroin to kids. Anthony watched him for months, waiting for the right moment. He caught him one night outside a rundown apartment building, his pockets full of cash and his eyes full of greed. One swing of the hammer, and he was gone. Then there was the businessman who embezzled millions from the retirement funds of his employees, leaving families destitute. Anthony found him in his garage, getting into his brand new car. The hammer struck with precision, and the man's body slumped over the steering wheel, never to betray another trust. Years passed, and Anthony continued his work, unnoticed and unsuspected. The small ball peen hammer became an extension of him, a tool as familiar as his own hands. He killed cleanly, quickly, always making sure to leave no trace behind. He didn't leave messages or taunt the police. He didn't need recognition. Each death was like a puzzle, and he relished the process of figuring out how to solve it, how to get close enough, how to strike without anyone seeing. He was careful, meticulous, and above all, patient. He didn't rush, and he never took unnecessary risks. The police never connected the killings. There was no pattern they could follow, no motive they could discern. The victims were too varied: criminals, abusers, predators. The only common thread was that they were all, in Anthony's mind, scum. But to the outside world, they were random tragedies, the results of an uncaring universe. Anthony preferred it that way. The fewer people who knew about him, the better. He didn't need the world to know what he was doing. He only needed to continue. To keep his hammer swinging, his sense of justice intact. And so, Anthony Haener remains a ghost, a shadow in the night. A man who walks among the ordinary, unnoticed, unremarkable. But behind his quiet exterior lies a calculating mind, a sense of purpose that drives him to kill, again and again. Not for pleasure, not for fame, but because he believes, deep down, that it's the right thing to do. The ball peen hammer rests in his hand, and with it, he decides who deserves to live and who deserves to die. And as long as there is scum in the world, Anthony Haener will never stop.